Hi everyone, and welcome to this mythic dungeon guide for the Dawn of the Infinite in Dragonflight Patch 10.1.5. Our first boss is Chronikar. The tank mechanic here is Chrono Shear. This deals heavy physical damage and applies a healing absorb as well as a damage taken increase to the tank. The healer needs to quickly heal through the absorb shield, at which point the damage taken debuff becomes dispellable. Tanks, be ready with mitigation and self-healing if possible to deal with the increased damage taken until you can be dispelled. Sand Stomp targets every player and drops a sand pool at their feet that deals arcane damage over time and slows their haste and movement speed. Drop these pools out to the edges of the room if you can to conserve space. Aeon Shatter will target a random player's location, and after a few seconds, Chronikar will leap to that location and send out a volley of orbs in all directions. This ability then repeats by targeting a second and third player. Move out of the circle when Chronikar is going to land, but be ready to soak the smaller circle that spawns nearby. Each time she casts Aeon Shatter, you'll see a small circle on the ground, usually somewhere inside the bigger circle. These small circles are called Aeon Residue. Always make sure one person in your group is soaking Aeon Residue, as it will likely wipe your group if the ability hits the ground. You also need to take turns soaking each Aeon Residue, as you'll get a debuff that makes soaking the next circle deadly. This boss has very few mechanics, but they need to be executed perfectly or else you'll likely wipe. Let's move on to the second boss. Next is the manifested Timeways. Keep this boss engaged in melee range as it remains fixed in the center of the room and will deal pulsing group-wide damage unless it is engaged in melee. When you pull the boss, the floor will be split into 4 rotating quadrants and you will get a different debuff depending on which part you stand in. Standing in the lighter quadrants will grant you accelerated time, which deals arcane damage to you over time and increases your movement speed. Standing in the darker quadrants will grant you decaying time, which also deals arcane damage but reduces your damage taken. These 2 time zones need to be utilized throughout the fight to manage the boss's mechanics. For example, the tank mechanic is Unwind, which deals arcane damage in a frontal cone in 2 consecutive hits. However, if the tank stands inside a decaying time zone when the cast goes off, the time between the 2 hits is delayed significantly, allowing you to recover the damage more easily. Chrono-Faded is a magic effect that will tick for arcane damage on its target. If that target is inside an accelerated time zone, the debuff will tick more rapidly. Dispelling Chrono-Faded sends out a circular wave that expands from the player's location and deals damage every half second to anyone it passes through. And if dispelled inside an accelerated time zone, the ring will expand incredibly fast and not have much time to deal much damage to you. So quickly move to an accelerated time zone to get dispelled if you are targeted with Chrono-Faded. Fragments of Time sends out waves of orbs in all directions from the boss that travel faster if inside accelerated time and slower in decaying time. Getting hit by an orb will deal initial arcane damage and apply a stacking dot for each orb you hit, so dodge them as best as you can. The difference in their speed should open up gaps between the orbs for you to run through to avoid damage from this mechanic. The next boss is the Blight of Galakrond, and at various health percentages you'll fight different bosses. At the start of the fight, you face the Blight itself, which will leave pools on the ground where it travels, and if stationary, a pool will expand continuously from beneath the boss, so try to manage movement here to keep the boss moving slightly every few seconds. Corrosion will be applied to a random player, which deals initial nature damage to them and applies a dot. There will also be swirlies for everyone to dodge when this mechanic goes off. Corrosion can be transferred to another player by running over them with the debuff. If corrosion expires, the targeted player will be mind controlled. To avoid this, the targeted player should hold on to corrosion for a few seconds and then run it to the tank, as the boss can remove the debuff for you with the tank mechanic called Blight Reclamation. This is a frontal directed at the tank that deals physical damage and removes corrosion. Keep an eye on the duration of your corrosion debuff and give it to the tank just before the boss casts Blight Reclamation. At 80% health, the boss transfers to Anzon. During this time, the boss still casts corrosion and Blight Reclamation and still leaves pools on the ground, so keep playing this part the same as phase 1. Anzon will also use Necrotic Wind, which deals group-wide nature damage, pushes players away, and sends out waves of tornadoes that deal nature damage and knock you back. Finally, at 50%, Anzon deactivates and you fight 2 new dragons at once, Loskaleth and Dazak, and you'll still need to manage all the other mechanics from phase 1 in this final phase. These last 2 bosses take 100% of the damage dealt to the other, so optimize your cleave damage here. Loskaleth is the main boss, while Dazak is mostly just there as an annoyance to your group and doesn't need to be tanked. Necrofrost targets a player and immobilizes them in an attackable block of ice that reduces their haste and deals ticking frost damage to them. Your group should switch to the Necrofrost and destroy it quickly, as this cannot be removed or dispelled. Dazak will cast an incinerating Blight Breath, which is a frontal that can be sidestepped, and he will also spam Noxious Ejection at random players for small single target damage that your healer needs to manage. Up next, you'll fight Iridikron, and Chromie will be there to help you throughout the encounter. Hold on to your big DPS cooldowns and lust if you have it for the end of this fight. Also, healers need to make sure they keep Chromie alive during this encounter or else you will wipe. The tank mechanic is Crushing Onslaught, causing Iridikron's successful melee attacks to increase the tank's physical damage taken for a short time, and this effect stacks. Extinction Blast will target a random player, which is a one-shot mechanic if not dealt with correctly. Chromie will teleport somewhere close by to the targeted player, who then needs to stand inside her timeline protection bubble to reduce their damage taken by 97%. Only the targeted player needs to do this. Everyone else can move out of the area of effect. Once Extinction Blast goes off, Chromie will be exhausted and take 4000% increased damage. Don't let her die during this time. Iridikron will then target Chromie with Stonecracker Barrage. The healer and all DPS should move into the big soak circle around Chromie, while the tank should stand in the smaller soak circle on their own in front of the rest of the group. Soaking these circles will split the damage of Stonecracker Barrage and help Chromie survive. Once it is over, Chromie drops her exhaustion and grants all players increased haste for 25 seconds. Healers should focus on topping Chromie up quickly before returning to healing the group. Earth Surge sends out waves of shards that need to be dodged, as well as pools that they momentarily leave on the ground. The shards will expand outwards in a staggered pizza slice pattern, so be ready to move between them. Pulverizing Exhalation creates a massive AoE circle around the boss, in addition to an equally massive breath at the same time, and putting circles around each player that spawn an ad when the cast goes off. Your group needs to move out of the AoE and the breath, and stack up close together to spawn all of the ads close by to make it easier to cleave them down. These ads will constantly cast Stone Bolt at players, which deals nature damage and applies a bleed to affected targets. Keep them interrupted and focus them down quickly. Finally, at 100 energy, Iridikron begins a long cast called Cataclysmic Obliteration. Chromie will teleport in front of the boss and channel Timeline Transcendence, which buffs players' damage done, haste, cooldown recharge rate, and resource regeneration rate massively. This is the time to pop major offensive cooldowns and lust if you have it, as you need to reduce Iridikron's energy to 0 by dealing as much damage to him as possible to stop the cast from going off. At the same time, your group will suffer heavy ticking damage, so use defensives to help your healer. If Iridikron's cast goes off, you will wipe, but if you manage to get him to 0 energy, his cast will be interrupted and the encounter is complete. Next up is Tyr the Infinite Keeper, and this fight has 2 phases. Most of Tyr's abilities in phase 1 will leave behind pools of consecrated ground, which deals ticking arcane damage to anyone inside it. So to conserve space, tank the boss around the edge of the room and work your way around. This saves room towards the middle of the platform, which you will need to utilize in phase 2. The tank mechanic is Titanic Blow, which is a frontal that needs to be faced away from the rest of the group. This deals physical damage and leaves a pool of consecrated ground. Infinite Annihilation is another frontal targeted at a random player. Stack up to bait this around the edge of the room, as the ability leaves a large consecrated patch in the shape of the frontal. Dividing Strike is a group soak ability that everyone needs to stand in to spread the damage. This will also leave consecrated ground. Spark of Tyr targets 2 players at the same time, and applies a magic debuff to them that deals arcane damage over time to them and anyone within a few yards of them. Healers need to dispel and recover the group-wide damage that goes out once one of the debuffs is removed, before dispelling the second. Once Tyr runs out of energy, Phase 2 begins. He will shield himself and start siphoning the Oathstone in the centre of the room. At the same time, orbs will begin to travel from the outside of the platform towards the Oathstone. Players need to intercept these orbs, as each one that hits the Oathstone will increase the power of Tyr's Absorb Shield. Also, picking up orbs grants players increased haste and movement speed, up to a maximum of 5 stacks. Now is the time to group up around the middle of the room to cover every angle that the orbs are flying to the Oathstone from. This is why it's best to keep the boss around the edge of the room during Phase 1. Staying near the middle also lets your healer recover damage in Phase 2, as Tyr will periodically be dealing group-wide damage and knocking you back. Once he has finished siphoning, use your haste buff to break his Absorb Shield quickly, and you return to Phase 1 to repeat the encounter. The next boss is Morchie. The tank mechanic in this fight is Sand Blast, which deals heavy physical damage to any players in a line in front of her, so tanks should face Morchie away from the group, and everyone should be ready to move out of the way just in case. More Problems spawns mirror images of Morchie around the edge of the room, and your group needs to identify the real one before the end of her Dragon Breath cast. The real Morchie should be the one without a debuff under her unit frame. Once you've found her, make sure you stand to the side of her to avoid lethal damage from the Dragon Breath. Getting hit by the breath also applies a nasty debuff that your healer will have to deal with. Time traps summon 5 traps on the ground nearby that will root you if you step into one. Avoid these yourselves, but be ready to use them for Morchie's next ability, Familiar Faces. This will spawn mirror images of players that fixate them. These need to be kited through the time traps to root them. Just note that each time Morchie casts Familiar Faces, the mirror images will be freed from their traps and you will need to kite them again. Each time a time trap is triggered, your group will take damage, so let your healer recover the damage before triggering too many at once. The next encounter is the Time Lost Battlefield. After fighting through 2 waves of mini-bosses, the main boss will spawn. If you're an Alliance player, you'll fight Horde, and if you're Horde, you'll fight Alliance, but the mechanics of the fight are the same in both instances. The main boss is either Anduin or Grommash, depending on your faction, and their tank mechanic deals physical damage and reduces their target's healing taken for a short time. They will also cast multiple shockwaves in quick succession that face a new direction each time it is cast. Be ready to sidestep this, as it's a fairly quick cast. The boss will summon 3 adds at a time to join the fight, and there are 3 add types. A warrior add, which deals regular physical damage and has no real abilities of note, a hunter, which attacks players at range and applies a bleed, as well as a conjurer or a warlock, which has an AoE damage mechanic and a dispellable dot. Group these adds up and focus them down quickly so you aren't overrun during the fight. The boss will also bladestorm around the room, dealing nature damage to anyone within a few yards every second. Stay away from this. The final boss is Chrono-Lord Deios, and this fight has 2 phases. In both phases, the tank mechanic is Temporal Breath, dealing arcane damage in a frontal cone that also applies a dot for additional arcane damage. Tanks face this away from the group. He will summon 1 Infinite Keeper at a time, which will run to a specific location and begin opening a portal to summon more adds. Kill these as quickly as possible to stop your group from being overrun with adds, especially as the boss will summon more Infinite Keepers who will begin opening their own portals. The Keepers will also have an interruptible cast called Infinite Blast, which deals a small amount of single target damage to a random player. They will also apply Chronal Burn, which is a dispellable dot for arcane damage over time. Defeating Infinite Keepers is the main way of dealing significant damage to the boss, so focus them down as a priority. Time-displaced troopers will spawn from the portals who don't do anything of note and should be very easy to cleave down. The last mechanic in Phase 1 is Infinite Orb. This calls down 2 orbs at a time at random locations, which fall slower when a player is standing beneath one. When an orb hits the ground, it deals arcane damage to all players and increases their damage taken by the same ability for a few seconds. So the way to manage this is to let one orb fall to the ground on its own, or having the other orb soaked by a player to slow it down enough to let the debuff expire from the first orb. At 20% health, phase 2 begins. The temporal breath tank mechanic remains in this phase, as do the infinity orbs. Infinite corruption spawns lots of overlapping swirlies nearby that need to be avoided or else you'll suffer heavy arcane damage. These swirlies also spawn pools on the ground that last for a long time, so since they spawn based on players' locations, try to stack up away from the middle of the room to bait them out of the way so you have room for the rest of the fight. Then it's simply a race to defeat Deios before the room becomes filled with dead zones, similar to his encounter in Alderman. And there you have it. That is my complete guide to every boss in the Dawn of the Infinite Mega Dungeon on Mythic difficulty. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you'd like to see more guide content like this from me in the future. Best of luck in the new dungeon, have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye!